Before I get into this video, we hit another milestone for the channel earlier in the week as we are now at 800 strong. Thank you all so much. The support for the channel has been incredible this year, and whether you're a new or old subscriber, just know I truly do appreciate the love. I also recently got invited to my first podcast with J-Man Shu, where we talked some Arkham and Fallout for about 3.5 hours. It was an absolute blast. That podcast will be in the description below. Go check it out. Enough vamping though, and enjoy today's video. Here we are, the final part for my series of retrospectives covering the Bioshock games, as we conclude this series with Bioshock Infinite's 2-part DLC, Burial at Sea. Now, what is different about Burial at Sea compared to the rest of the entries in the series is that I actually only played this DLC a year or two ago, and because of this, my classic test of nostalgia is much lesser with this one. I adored Burial at Sea, primarily because of the story, just due to the gameplay feeling like DLC, smaller and more condensed. But the story adds to both the original Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite's universe, and it just feels good to be back in the city of Rapture. But the question is, how does Burial at Sea hold up today? Today I'll be going over the story and gameplay of both episodes and see how the Bioshock series would end up concluding for now. Burial at Sea takes place yet again in the city of Rapture on the 31st of December 1958, a date we've seen already in the beginning of Bioshock 2, but from a different perspective. We again take on the role of Booker DeWitt, this time a private investigator in Rapture. As we are approached by a mysterious woman we quickly find out is Elizabeth. I have mysterious woman in air quotes because I don't know if my brightness was too high or what, but it is portrayed as though she is supposed to have some sort of reveal, but I clearly can see her as soon as she comes through the door. Elizabeth asks Booker to investigate the disappearance of a young girl named Sally. Booker believes Sally to be dead, or worse, a little sister, but Elizabeth insists she is alive, and says Sander Cohen may have the information we are looking for as to her whereabouts. As we leave Booker's office is when Rapture gets its grand reveal. Not broken down or chaotic, as we have seen previously, but bright and bustling, finally seeing the city of Rapture for what it is intended to be. This reveal is really quite fitting for Bioshock Infinite's DLC, because we saw how Columbia functioned as a city from the beginning, and then saw it progressively fall into chaos. But we have only briefly seen how Rapture used to function, and this intro of exploring a fully functioning Rapture was beautiful. We got to see the practical uses for plasmids, the big daddies at work repairing the city, the little sister's beginnings, and not only does this city inside the walls of Rapture feel more alive, but the waters outside also have more life to them. After exploring around Rapture and finding an invitation to Cohen's party and see what Cohen is working on with his performance art, which doesn't end well for the performers,
Fitzpatrick!
Please!
Thus, save him for God's sake! My views shall not be mocked!
and Cohen makes Elizabeth and Booker replace them in return for giving us information about Sally, whilst also warning Booker about Elizabeth's intentions. Cohen, displeased with Booker and Elizabeth's performance, shocks them both unconscious, but does keep his end of the bargain and drags them to a bathysphere as he claims it will take them to Sally. Once we awaken, we realize the bathysphere is heading away from the city and down to the sea floor, where Ryan had just sunk Fontaine's department store, and Cohen reveals that Sally is in the housewares building, and it's here on the sea floor that Rapture becomes much more of a familiar sight, as the department store and and Fontaine's men have all fallen into chaos. Not much more story happens until we reach Housewares though, when we find Sally moving around through the vents, and after closing off all the exits, Elizabeth says the only way to flush her out is by turning up the heat. This somewhat works and reveals Booker's fear was true, and Sally has been transformed into a little sister. In shock, Booker still tries to drag her out of the vent as she calls for a big daddy, but after taking care of him is when the episode's twist occurs. Whilst trying to drag Sally out of the vent, memories start to flood back to Booker, where it reveals not only is this Booker a very regretful Comstock who worked with the Luteces to take Booker's child Anna, but in that universe, not the same as Infinite's. Instead of losing a finger in the struggle, this struggle ended up decapitating Anna/Elizabeth. As Booker, now revealed to be Comstock, comes to, he remembers the Luteces used the tear device to move him to Rapture, so that he could forget and move far away from his troubles. Comstock passionately apologizes to Elizabeth, but to no avail.
You're about to be.
The Big Daddy, not actually dead, ends up impaling Comstock with his drill, and the final scene of the episode leaves Comstock looking over at a merciless Elizabeth covered in his blood. Episode 2 begins on a much happier note than episode 1 left us with. Elizabeth is finally in Paris. It is bright, everyone is saying hello. Everyone is saying hello.
Bonjour, mademoiselle.
Bonjour, Elisabeth.
Bien le bonjour.
Bonjour, mon ami.
Bonne journée. Bonne journée.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Yeah, this is a dream quickly realized upon finding Sally, as the atmosphere takes a sudden turn into a nightmare, feeling guilt for burning Sally all to get to Comstock. This was a great introduction. The happy Disney movie like Paris quickly falling into darkness, following Sally into the furnace only to turn around and find her standing behind you. Not only does it have a visual pop, it's actually quite creepy, but it shows Elizabeth's immediate guilt for pursuing revenge, a theme that this episode runs with. After the nightmare, Elizabeth awakens to Sally being taken away by Atlas and his men, but before they can shoot Elizabeth, she has a vision of Booker, who coaches her into saying the right things to keep her alive, namely being, she can help them escape this prison and return to the city, only in return though for Sally. Atlas agrees to the terms and leaves Elizabeth, which after some exploring she finds her own dead body in the rubble. Elizabeth realizes her former self was killed by the same Big Daddy that killed Comstock. The reason we are another Elizabeth in the same location as we were left off is because Elizabeth's powers allowed her to continue to exist in another multiverse, but her sense of guilt for using Sally to seek revenge on Comstock moved her to go back to Rapture and clean up the mess she left. The Luteces advised Elizabeth not to return to Rapture, as she would lose her ability to open tears because she would be cut off from the alternate universe's Elizabeths and would be much more vulnerable in this state. But she ignored this advice to save Sally. Suchong is the key to escaping this prison, as we finally track down his lab to not only learn that he knows about Columbia, but he had also built a Lutece device connecting back to the floating city. This is the key to raising the prison back to Rapture, as by going back to Columbia, Elizabeth can use the Lutece particle that kept Columbia afloat on the department store. We head through the tear and back to Columbia to get the Lutece particle, simple enough, but Suchong won't allow us to return until we get a lock of hair from Fink's laboratories. On our way to Fink's labs, we learn why Daisy Fitzroy went through such a drastic change in Infinite, as we find out the Luteces instructed Fitzroy to take Fink's son hostage, promising that with her death, the city would fall. I will admit this moment can be seen as damage control to a certain degree for the criticisms of Infinite's plot holes, but I still appreciated this moment, and it is a great showing as to how much Fitzroy wanted her revolution to matter, whether she got to see it or not.
Your part in the play.
Or the play itself.
Turn her into a killer? How?
Give the girl no choice.
And she will be forced to make one.
Elizabeth also learns that Fink and Suchong have been communicating through the Tear Rift on many projects like plasmids and vigors, but also the creation of both Songbird and the Big Daddy's technology, because Fink had linked the Songbird to Elizabeth, and Suchong is yet to successfully bond the Big Daddies and Little Sisters, hence why we needed a lock of Elizabeth's hair. Once we collect a hair sample, we return back to Rapture, and after giving Suchong the hair sample, we make it to the top of the department store to use the Lutece particle and see the building begin to rise. It doesn't take long for Atlas's men to capture her, believing her to be more valuable than she led on. Atlas proceeds to torture Elizabeth, asking where the ace in the hole is, with threats of lobotomizing her and the use of truth serum, but she remains silent until the threats change towards Sally, and in a panic, Elizabeth recalls a future she witnessed and tells Atlas that the ace in the hole is in Suchong's lab. Atlas again holds Sally hostage until she holds up her end of the bargain of finding the ace, and we head to Suchong's lab and find the coded message, the ace. After returning to Atlas, we decode the message for him. Would you kindly? Which Atlas realizes is the trigger phrase Suchong implanted within Jack. Now having no use for Elizabeth, Atlas delivers a fatal strike to her head and leaves her alone with Sally. In her final moments, we have a final vision of the end of Bioshock with the saved Little Sisters, a future she came to Rapture to ensure would happen, and the game ends with Elizabeth smiling at Sally as she dies. And that's the main story for Burial at Sea episode 1 and 2. There is a lot of story to digest in just a 4-hour experience, and this was the reason I wanted to ensure this was a separate video, because I loved experiencing this story. Whilst episode 1 is a more gameplay focused episode, it still has a lot of intrigue in the story. Why does Elizabeth want to help this girl? What is her motive is a question asked very early on. But the twist is brutal. Again, Booker is Comstock, we've seen that before. But this reality's Comstock being filled with such guilt from killing Elizabeth and forcing him to go to another reality, memories wiped to live out his days, was great. And seeing Elizabeth being so cold and merciless seeing him die was a great way to end the first episode. Exploring a functional Rapture, learning more about the beginnings of the Little Sisters and Big Daddies around the world through the new videos, a feature brought in from Infinite. But the story really does go to another level with episode 2. The previously on isn't even about refreshing you on episode 1, but the original Bioshock, so you knew from the beginning this was going to really try and conclude the series. The thick atmosphere in the beginning showing Elizabeth's guilt in regards to Sally, and the reason she returned after the Elizabeth we were with in episode 1 is found to be dead. My favourite aspect of this episode that doesn't really impact the main story but was a really great insight into Elizabeth is her still talking things through with Booker, who acts as her subconscious. Booker is used to great effect in this episode because it allows Elizabeth to show a wide range of emotions, but easily my favorite is this moment of pure panic and fear.
I don't know what to do, Booker. Booker? Booker! No, please. Please just don't leave me here! Booker!
Elizabeth talks to Booker as if he isn't her subconscious, and you really do understand just how alone she truly feels. It was one of my personal highlights of the story. I also love seeing Suchong and Fink's collaborations, especially in regards to the Big Daddies. Whilst I enjoyed having an explanation for vigors, more information about Songbird, and the construction of the Handymen, seeing the Big Daddy and the Little Sister bond being created was the best of the game's backstories. The Big Daddies and Little Sisters are yet to realize how important they are to one another, which we see when a Big Daddy is gravely injured and the little sisters are cowering, and only with the help of Elizabeth do we see the connection become realized. We get to see some audio diaries come to life from previous games, explore pre-war Rapture, more of Columbia, and back to the Rapture we are all familiar with. Burial at Sea's story does a great job at linking the two worlds of Columbia and Rapture, and for the last Bioshock experience for now, it does a great job at feeling like the series has come full circle. And if for nothing else, the story alone is why this DLC is worth playing. The gameplay is where this experience becomes much more straightforward to talk about, especially in regards to Episode 1. In Episode 1, the gameplay is a mix between Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite. Some weapons are changed from Infinite, we get a new plasmid, but the real change is to the money and ammo. You have little of both for most of the game, and it does feel like Irrational Games addressing the criticism of Infinite that it was too easy, because whilst not overly challenging still, it is more so, just because you seemingly are always struggling to have a fully stocked weapon. Other than that though, I'd feel like I was repeating myself in terms of gameplay for Episode 1. It feels like a mix of mechanics in the series. Episode 2 on the other hand does change the formula a little more with Elizabeth. Elizabeth isn't Booker, or Jack Ryan, or Subject Delta. She isn't great with guns, and while she can pick up and use some guns, it quickly makes you regret that decision. Episode 2, because of this, is somewhat of a stealth game. Is it the best stealth game I've played? No, but it is still a lot of fun, and looks to borrow a lot from Dishonored and Thief. Both series I absolutely adore. You will be crouched a lot of the game, looking at the floor, making sure you aren't making too much noise. But if you do this, it isn't overly difficult to avoid being detected, especially when you take into account the new plasmid, Peeping Tom, aka invisibility or seeing through walls. In terms of weapons, Elizabeth's go-to is the crossbow, with 3 different bolts being the tranquilizer, noisemaker, and gas. Basically the standard, but most of the time you will just be using the tranquilizer, and this will take out most enemies with a single shot, and that's the same with melee attacks in stealth. Whilst if the enemy knows you are there, the melee is useless, but in stealth you can again take out most enemies in just a single hit. That is the standard gameplay loop, and I acknowledge it isn't the most fully fledged experience, or the most challenging in regards to Episode 2. I don't really know how to explain it. I just had fun playing the game. The gameplay on the whole isn't the most fleshed out, but I still found a lot of enjoyment to be had here. Bioshock Infinite's DLC, Burial at Sea, is an experience you could break down, analyze, and easily find some problems with. I don't do that personally, and I can acknowledge that the experience isn't without flaws. However, on the whole, I loved my time with Burial at Sea. It adds a lot to both Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite. It expands more on the many worlds theory, and the beginning of the descent to Rapture we know and love. Whilst the gameplay isn't why I would personally want to replay this experience, the story certainly is. The twist at the end of Episode 1 is merciless and grim, and leads us into Elizabeth's perspective, seeing her fears and struggles with trying to ensure the right events that she isn't even quite sure of are falling into place. I love this experience, and I can honestly say if you weren't the biggest fan of Infinite and never played Burial at Sea, go and play it. It ties together the series and leaves us with a concluded Bioshock series for now.